The Quest by Dorothy Thomson from the winter 1963 issue of The Vegan. Simon crept softly into the calm July night. He could still hear them arguing about the bomb and Hiroshima's unspeakable fate. There, in the softly shaded light of the country inn, he often spent a few hours in the Blue Ball, which, nestled like a kitten at the foot of the Quantock Hills. It was a few miles from his cottage in the little village of Stuckumber, which lay between Taunton and Minehead. A warm red glow came from the latticed window, and he could see them waving their arms excitedly in the heat of the argument. They seemed to Simon almost like silhouettes from Dante's Inferno, as their vague shapes rose and fell in the red light. The Colonel's clipped speech rose above the others, rapping out sentences like a typewriter, Simon thought. Although he gave the impression that he had pronounced the last word upon the subject, one knew that he was mustering up strength for the next ferocious onslaught. The languid pacifist with the cold grey eyes was lounging in the most comfortable chair, holding forth upon the principle of non-violence in a pious voice, that the next meal of beefsteak that he would relish came from an animal that he had met with violence for this specific end. Never for a moment occurred to him his approach to this principle was of very limited nature. He could faintly hear the voice of the whining little widow. She was negation personified, lamenting her departed spouse with the sentimentality of which only the insensitive are capable. From what Simon had heard, the poor man had been completely subordinated to this domineering little woman, but as is usually the case with this particular mentality, distance lends enchantment, with the result that he who could do nothing right in his life, in death seemed to have been incapable of doing anything wrong. She was agreeing with everything the Colonel said. Why, of course they should have bombed Hiroshima. Think of all the Western lives that were saved. Why, the war might have gone on for years. My God, thought Simon, they almost make it seem like an act of compassion in their attempt at self-justification. What did these robots know of Hiroshima, or of right and wrong, or of anything fundamental? Were they not so conditioned from birth that the weeds of propaganda and cruel custom choked the blossoms of creative thought? How could they reason at all in the true sense of the world? For nearly 2 hours he had listened as platitudes slipped from puerile lips. They had quoted proverbs with voices as profound as though they had brought these veterans to birth. When would the human spirit break through these self-made barriers, a free and winged thing towards the star of truth? Stupidity alone could anger Simon, who could be so tender with all living creatures, feeling the one spirit flowing through them all. Cruelty to the defences sickened his soul, for it seemed to him to strike at the very core of life, which is rooted in cooperation and love. Like a highly tuned instrument, he vibrated to every touch of life, and his identification with pain was a continual source of suffering. He had wanted to understand when the outrage of Hiroshima had struck at the very centre of his being, and had shaken it to the foundations. Like a stricken tree, he had been bowed beneath the storm of his own conflict. He had felt bereft, as the branches of his mind would never flower again. He remembered how his misery had taken him to Hiroshima, and his sense of personal guilt that had made him want to suffer as they were suffering. He had wanted to write and tell the world how bitterly wrong they were. He was so young then, he had believed they would understand. He shuddered now as he recalled his impressions when he had seen those hopeless figures which even now moved in nightmare procession in his dreams. It was the terrifying acceptance of and the familiarity with pain of those doomed figures waiting for death that he had been the cause of his own mental and physical breakdown. But the answer never came. He had not written a word. Even when much later the troubled waves of his mind had subsided, no muse reflected its face in the calm waters. Only blank negation looked from its smooth surface. Nevertheless, he knew that deep down within himself was the potentiality of creative liberation, but like a maimed bird, he dragged his broken wings upon the ground, remembering the lofty regions of his former creative days. So he had laid aside his pen, and the music was stilled. Only a vague cadence would steal stealthily through his brain. Then he would close the shutters of his heart and mind. Somerset had laid its magic on him, an enchantment that stilled the conflict in his breast. Here the red earth glowed beneath the sun, and impatient for spring the wildflowers pushed their way through the rich soil in early March. The streams ran like banners of silver, washing and foaming the clean brown stones. Everywhere in Somerset is the sweet murmur of water, by hedge and wood and field, and the great clouds hang low as they move majestically over the crest of the Quantock Hills. The poignant beauty helped to still his restless spirit, and he drank it deeply, as a drunkard seeks forgetfulness, without satiety, feeding upon its own desire. But it could not still the unanswerable questions that filled his mind. It was but an anodyne to bring a temporary release. Always he had wanted desperately to know and understand the truth in all things. Even now, he wondered why the man staying in the inn, who during the argument had quoted sanctimoniously, "Thou shalt not kill," had nevertheless killed birds and rabbits without remorse. Illogically and inconsistent, yet dissatisfied, they beat like restless waves upon a rock of their own early conditioning. Their voices became a faint murmur as he walked down the lane, which was heavy with the scent of honeysuckle. Beyond the gently rising patchwork of ploughland, he could see the soft line of the quantocks. Stoic and sublime, they were the fickle, weather-like garments changing with every mood. Sometimes they flaunted saffron and green with patches of dusky brown. In brooding storms, the great grey wings of cloud would hover above him, throwing strange shadows upon their sides. Then a twilight mystery hung about them, an enchantment Simon preferred to their more flippant days of green and gold. There was peace up there, close to the clouds, whether the heather grew 4 feet high on the steep sides, and among it grew great blue whortleberries like beads on their strong stems. As Simon walked, the moon lit the leaves with a ghostly light, and in the fields beyond the hedges the sheep showed whitely humped in innocent sleep. His long legs took him towards the pine woods, where small lives lived without the conscious torturing pain which is the human lot. Once in the wood, how still the night seemed. A light wind touched the pines with delicate fingers, and their scent descended like a balm upon his spirit. He sat beneath them, on the slippery pine needles, and looked up where the full moon was rising like Aphrodite from the sea of silver. Here, in the silence and close to the dark earth, was peace. Only the whir of a wing stirred as a white owl descended moth-like from a nearby branch. His mind seemed suddenly to be suspended in space without thought. The peace of the July night was so calm and still that feeling alone flowed through his being like an elixir. Suddenly, out of the silence came the sound of breaking twigs, followed by a loud report. A pain which he scarcely recognised as such pierced his left breast. "Damn!" yelled an angry voice. "Missed him!" Then came another report with "Got him this time," as the rabbit fell with a scream which seemed to tear the night apart. Then came the sound of breaking twigs as they came quite near to collect their prey. Simon remained unseen in the dark shadow of the pines. The poachers moved on talking and laughing, unconscious that a man lay mortally wounded a few yards away. They had made their kill. Simon could have called, but some strange instinct, inexplicable even to himself, prevented him. His eyes were growing misty now as he looked up at the clear night sky, where, cold and pure and impersonal, the stars looked down upon his lonely pain. He saw, like an opening flower, the crimson stain expanding on his tweed jacket, and without remorse he felt his life slowly ebbing away in a dark stream. Now he and the dead rabbit and the pine-scented night seemed one with the void and its clustered stars that swept the Milky Way and moved as he did towards some exorable goal. The dark ocean of pain closed in around him and receded. He remained motionless and expectant. He suddenly felt light. A mystery enveloped him which he vaguely tried to understand. It was then a surge of pity for the whole swept him like a wave upon its flood, liberating him. In this moment, out of becoming, he was being one with all that is and ever was. In a flash, he saw the tormentor and the tormented as one. He knew at length, in this complete rounded moment of time which is eternity, the answer he had sought, while wild things screamed in the night and a cloud of smoke mushroomed up like an evil genius in his quiet places, spreading pestilence and decay. Never more would the illusion of separation spread its net upon his heart. His ears had been deaf to the music of life. He had not heard the symphony, but listened to the separate notes. Compassion was the theme that would persist until its message was echoed throughout the universe. With these last thoughts, his spirit spread its wings to freedom and to peace.